He was very careful to protect me from the frustration and too often humiliation that had cursed the lives of many vice presidents. I want to thank the President for the good choices he made with key personnel. We don't have time to mention many of them, but Stu Eisenstadt comes as close as possible to rivaling President Carter's formidable work ethic. Hamilton Jordan and Jody Powell were blessings every day, to me, to the President, and to the nation. One of the things that dawned on me during the course of our time together was how well we were together and how we understood each other. I think one of the realities that Carter was a devout Christian who grew up in a small town and was active in his faith for almost every moment of his life. I was also a small-town kid who grew up in a Methodist church where my dad was a preacher, and our faith was core to me, as Carter's faith was core to him. That common commitment to our faith created a bond between us that allowed us to understand each other and find ways to work together. He allowed me to take a leadership role on issues that never would have happened before. For instance, he directed and trusted me to take a central role in trying to bring decency to the Vietnamese and Southeast Asian boat people who were fleeing their country. With President Carter's orders, the boat people were picked up by our great Navy from their flimsy boats, which were capsizing, and taken to safety. Most became good American citizens working for a healthy and prosperous nation. Joan loved her time as the second lady. And we have Jimmy and Rosalind to thank for helping her champion the public arts and for just being so kind to her. These were good years for Joan and I. President Carter and I became very close friends. We often spent hours together throughout the day. We were working on real problems, not wasting time. The personal relationship we established while in office continued throughout our life. Carter was far-sighted. He put aside his short-term political interests to tackle challenges that demanded sacrifice, to protect our kids and grandkids from future harm. Very few people in the 1970s had heard the term climate change. Yet Carter put his presidency on the line to pass laws to conserve energy, deregulate new oil and gas prices, and invest in clean, renewable alternatives to fossil fuels. It wasn't a perfect program, but thanks to President Carter, U.S. energy consumption declined by 10% between 1979 and 1983. In many ways, he laid the foundation for future presidents to come to grips with climate change. Some thought he was crazy to fight so hard to pass these laws, but he was dead right, and we know that now. We also know that President Carter elevated human rights to the top of his agenda. Sometimes we forget how seriously he pushed to advance the rights of women. He proposed and signed the law extending the period for states to approve the Equal Rights Amendment. He appointed women to head the departments of Commerce, Education, HUD, and what is now HEW. Women on his White House staff played crucial roles in developing his highest priority energy and environmental proposals. And he dramatically increased the ranks of female circuit and district court judges, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg. In all, he appointed 5 times as many women to the federal bench as all of the previous presidents had from the beginning of our country. 2 decades ago, President Carter said he believed income inequality was the biggest global issue. More recently, in a 2018 commencement address at Liberty University, he said, "I think now the largest global issue is the discrimination against women and girls in this world." He concluded that until stubborn attitudes that foster discrimination against women change, the world cannot advance and poverty and income equality cannot be solved. Towards the end of our time in the White House, the President and I were talking about how we might describe what we tried, which remains an important summary of our work. We told the truth, we obeyed the law, and we kept the peace. That we did, Mr. President. I will always be proud and grateful to have had the chance to work with you towards noble ends. It was then and it will always be the most rewarding experience of my public career. Thank you.
Jimmy Carter was as close to being a Renaissance man as any president entering the Oval Office in modern times. He was skilled in an astonishing array of activities: farmer, businessman, nuclear engineer, naval submarine officer, woodworker, painter, fly fisherman, music lover, poet, author, Sunday school teacher, creator of the Carter Center, and yes, loving husband, father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, and Nobel Peace Prize winner. Behind that smile was a man of steel, discipline, and self-confidence. In 1974, when he was governor of Georgia, I suggested that if he ran for president and won a few Southern primaries, he might get lucky and be the vice presidential nominee for regional balance. With his broadest grin, he said, "Stu, I've already decided to run, but I will be the Democratic nominee for president, not vice president." For one of our nation's most religious presidents, it's appropriate to celebrate Jimmy Carter's remarkable life in this magnificent cathedral. His values gave him an unshakable sense of right and wrong, animated for civil rights at home and human rights abroad, and propelling him to major achievements as the only Democratic president elected between 1968 and 1992. His faith brought integrity to the presidency after the Watergate and Vietnam eras. "I'll never lie to you," he promised. It was a vow he fulfilled. But his faith respected other religions as well. He was the first president to light a Hanukkah menorah. He created the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which I had the honor of chairing. He had a Shabbat Camp David for the Israeli delegation. He came to our house for a Passover Seder, only weeks after he negotiated the treaty between Israel and Egypt. As we lay our 39th president to rest, it's time to redeem his presidency and also lay to rest. Greatest achievements came only as a former president. The test of American presidents is not the number of years they serve, but the duration of their accomplishments. By this measure, Jimmy Carter was among the most consequential one-term presidents in American history. His intellect, prodigious work habits, discipline, and mastery of details were crucial to his success at home and abroad. President Carter parked politics at the Oval Office door to do what he believed was the right thing, taking controversial challenges on, regardless of the political consequences, and frankly, there were many. Much of his agenda passed with bipartisan support, a quaint notion in today's hyper-polarized politics. Independent surveys indicate one of the highest success rates in passing major legislation of any American president. And he was remarkably accessible to the press and to the American people. This president from the deepest part of the Deep South championed civil rights, appointing more people of color and women to senior executive positions and judgeships than all previous 38 presidents before him. He created the Department of Education and dramatically increased funding for low, moderate-income students. And we can thank him for all the ethics in government laws, comprehensive civil service reform, the creation of FEMA to coordinate natural disaster relief and rebuilding that remain crucially important today. We see it in Los Angeles. Jimmy Carter was also the greatest environmental president since Theodore Roosevelt, adding 80 million acres in Alaska to the national park system. And his global 2000 report forecasts climate change. His energy bills were critical to move our country from dependence on foreign oil to energy security. We are now, as a result, the largest and gas producer in the world. He provided the first incentives for conservation, an inaugural of clean energy, and symbolized it with solar panels he installed on the White House roof. Underappreciated at the time, but now widely recognized by Republicans and Democrats alike, President Carter was the great deregulator, winning legislative battles to loosen the regulatory bonds and shackles on airlines, thereby democratizing air travel, on trucking and rails, therefore helping our supply chains be more efficient, telecommunications leading to the cable TV era, and even the beer industry, which encouraged local craft beers. And he did so without compromising health and safety. These laid the foundations for today's innovative economy. Nothing better embodies President Carter than how he dealt with the inflation that beleaguered the nation under three presidents, two Republican, Nixon and Ford, and himself during the 1970s. Over the objection of all of his advisors, he chose Paul Volcker to lead the Federal Reserve, knowing in advance that Volcker's tough monetary policy would raise interest rates and unemployment because Paul told him that, and would do so in a presidential election year. You take care of the economy, Paul. I'll take care of the politics. Inflation indeed dropped like a rock after he left office and remained low for decades. Abroad, Jimmy Carter laid the building blocks for a better world. He was the first president to make human rights a priority for U.S. foreign policy. And this led directly to the release of thousands of political prisoners in Latin America and stimulated them to a lasting democratic transition. He ushered in a new era of hemispheric relations with the Panama Canal treaties, the toughest legislative battle of his presidency. He uniquely combined the soft power of human rights, championing freedom for the communist East Bloc countries and tripling the emigration of Soviet Jews. He combined that with hard power, rebuilding America's military strength after its post-Watergate decline. He negotiated a major nuclear arms treaty, while at the same time initiated every single weapon system that came online in the 1980s. Those new weapons helped end the Cold War. He normalized relations with China, and even his critics applauded his tough measures after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Jimmy Carter's most lasting achievement, and the one I think he was most proud of, was to bring the first peace to the Middle East through the greatest act of personal diplomacy in American history, the Camp David Accords. For 13 days and nights, he negotiated with Israel's Menachem Begin and Egypt's Anwar Sadat, personally drafting more than 20 peace proposals and shuttling them between the Israeli and Egyptian delegations. And he saved the agreement at the 11th hour, and it was the 11th hour, by appealing to Begin's love of his grandchildren. For the past 45 years, the Egypt-Israel peace treaty has never been violated and laid the foundation for the Abraham Accord. On the other side of the ledger was Iran. Jimmy Carter did not lose Iran, the Shah did. But the hostage crisis was a major factor in denying him a second term, despite his support for the Shah, because he placed the safe return of the hostages above his own political fortunes. He took full responsibility for the failure of the bold hostage rescue mission and worked tirelessly even after his bitter re-election defeat to Ronald Reagan, securing their release on the last day of his presidency. In the end, Jimmy Carter taught all of us how to live a life fulfilled with faith and service. He said, "I have one life to live. I feel like God wants me to do the best I can do with it, to let me live my life so that it will be meaningful." Well, President, you've more than achieved that goal. He may not be a candidate Mount Rushmore, but he belongs in the foothills and the world safer. Jimmy Carter has earned his place in, but just as he was free with sometimes unsolicited advice for his presidential successors, the Lord of all creation should be ready for Jimmy's recommendations how to make God's realm a more peaceful place.
In my church, we sing a song that says, "From the moment that I wake up until I lay my head, I will sing of the goodness of God." I don't know how many people in here can say that. I know I can't. But my grandfather certainly can. From the moment that he woke up until he laid his head, his life was a testament to the goodness of God. And I thank all of you for being here to celebrate this life. To the presidents and first ladies, it is a great honor to have you here. You know the human side of the American presidency like no others, and we appreciate it. To the vice presidents, other distinguished guests and friends of all kinds, thank you for being here. To those of you who came from all across the world, thank you for being here to celebrate and pay tribute to my grandfather. I say grandfather, but we called him Papa, as many of you know. We called my grandmother Mom Carter, so we spent our time talking about Mom and Papa, and mostly, speaking of the human side of the presidency, just letting people know that they were regular folks. Yes, they spent in the governor's mansion and 4 years at the White House, but the other 92 years at home in Plains, Georgia. And one of the best ways to demonstrate that they were regular folks is to take them by that home. First of all, it looks like they might have built it themselves. Second of all, my grandfather was likely to show up at the door in some 70s short shorts and Crocs. And then you'd walk in the house and it was like thousands of other grandparents' house all across, seeing trophies on the walls. The refrigerator, of course, was papered with pictures of grandchildren and then great-grandchildren. Their main phone, of course, had a cord and was stuck to the wall in the kitchen, like a museum piece. And demonstrating their era roots, they had a little rack next to the sink where they would hang Ziploc bags to dry. And demonstrating that they changed with the times. Eventually he did get a cell phone, and one time he called me sort of early on in that process. And on my phone it said, "Papa Mobile." So I answered it, of course. I said, "Hey, Papa." He said, "Who's this?" I said, "This is Jason." He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm not doing anything. You called me." He said, "I didn't call you. I'm taking a picture." It was nuclear engineer, right? I mean, they were small town people who never forgot who they were and where they were from, no matter what happened in their lives. But I recognize that we are not here because he was just a regular guy. As you've heard from the other speakers, his political life and his presidency for me was not just ahead of its time, it was prophetic. He had the courage and strength to stick to his principles even when they were politically unpopular. As governor of Georgia half a century ago, he preached an end to racial discrimination and an end to mass incarceration. As president in the 1970s, as you've heard, he protected more land than any other president in history. 50 years ago, he was a climate warrior who pushed for a world where we conserved energy, limited emissions, and traded our reliance on fossil fuels for expanded renewable sources. And by the way, he cut the deficit, wanted to decriminalize marijuana, deregulated so many industries that he gave us cheap flights and, as you heard, craft beer. Basically, all of those years ago, he was the first millennial. And he could make great playlists, as we've heard as well. Maybe this is unbelievable to you, but in my 49 years, I never perceived a difference between his public face and his private one. He was the same person no matter who he was with or where he was. And for me, that's the definition of integrity. That honesty was matched by love, it was matched by faith. And in both public and private, my grandparents did fundamentally live their lives in an effort, as the Bible says, to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with their God. Sometimes I feel and felt like I shared my grandfather with the world. Today is one of those days. But really, he shared the world with me. The power of an atom, the beauty and complexity of a South Georgia forest. When we fished, he celebrated the majesty of everything from the smallest minnow to that grand circulation of waters. And he shared this love with my boys, taking these Atlanta public school kids out into the fields to show them about row crops and wild plums. In the end, his life is a love story. And of course, it's a love story about Jimmy and Rosalind and their 77 years of marriage and service. As the song says, they were the flagship of the fleet. And rest assured that in these last weeks, he told us that he was ready to see her again. But his life was also a broader love story about love for his fellow humans and about living out the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. I believe that that love is what taught him and told him to preach the power of human rights, not just for some people, but for all people. It focused him on the power and the promise of democracy, its love for freedom, its requirement and founding belief in the wisdom of regular people raising their voices, and the requirement that you respect all of those voices, not just some. That conviction made him a naval officer who believed and demonstrated, as you've heard, that the greatest power of America was not the military, but its values. And those values were personal to him, and he lived them both publicly and privately. As you heard Stu say, as president, he gave voice to dissidents, stood up to dictators, brought countries together in peace. His heart broke for the people of Israel. It broke for the people of Palestine, and he spent his life trying to bring peace to that holy land. And he talked about it at the dinner table. It was the same in public as it was in private. And for the last 40 years, as you've heard, he spent his time living out that love and that faith alongside the poorest and most marginalized people in the world. And that work, again, has been based fundamentally on love and respect. The Carter Center has 3,500 employees, but only a couple hundred in the United States. The rest are spread throughout the countries where we work: Ethiopia, South Sudan, Chad, Bangladesh, and all of the Carter Center's programs are based on a respect, that same respect for the power of regular people, even if they are in tiny villages, miles from anywhere else. To give one example, we've all heard a lot lately about guinea worm disease. It's an ancient and debilitating disease of poverty, and that disease will have existed from the dawn of humanity until Jimmy Carter. When he started working on this disease, there were 3.5 million cases in humans every year. Last year, there were 14. And the thing that's remarkable is that this disease is not eliminated with medicine. It's eliminated essentially by neighbors talking to neighbors about how to collect water in the poorest and most marginalized villages in the world. And those neighbors truly were my grandfather's partners for the last 40 years. And as this disease has been eliminated in every village in Nigeria, every village in Sudan or Uganda, what's left behind in those tiny 600-person villages is an army of Jimmy and Rosalind Carters who have demonstrated their own power to change their world. And that is a fundamental truth about my grandfather. It begins where it ends. When he saw a tiny 600-person village that everybody else thinks of as poor, he recognized it. That's where he was from. That's who he was. And he never saw it as a place to send pity. It was always a place to find partnership and power, and a place to carry out that commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. Essentially, he eradicated a disease with love and respect. He waged peace with love and respect. He led this nation with love and respect. To me, this life was a love story from the moment that he woke up until he laid his head. Conclude with this. As Andy Young told me, he may be gone, but he's not gone far. The outpouring of love and support that we have felt from you and from around the world has shows how many lives he has touched and how his spirit will live on in many ways for us. He'll be in the kitchen making pancakes, or in a wood shop finishing a cradle for a great-grandchild, standing in a trout stream with Mom Carter, or for me, just walking those Georgia fields and forests where he's from. Thank you.